The fact that there's so many different reasons that people have sex, I think goes to show us that it serves so many different functions. She's like, I love my estrogen patch, and when I die, I'm gonna have them tape it to my coffin.
I pretty much feel the same way.
Is it possible for women to have a good sex life based on all the observations you have for your, years of research?
It's sexual experience. You have to learn to have an orgasm.
Welcome to the XX Lab, where we explore the science and stories that matter to you. You guys, I'm so excited about today's guest. Today's guest is somebody I've admired for a really long time, and I mean that absolutely literally. I was actually her teaching assistant for her Psychology of Human Sexuality class at UT Austin back when I was in graduate school. So I have had a front row seat view of just how brilliant and passionate today's guest is about her work. Today's guest is Dr. Cindy Meston. She's professor of clinical psychology at the University of Texas at Austin, where she directs the Female Sexual Psychophysiology Laboratory. And this is one of the world's leading research labs on women's sexual experience. She's published over 200 peer-reviewed articles and is one of the most cited researchers in her field. In 2016, the BBC named her one of the 100 most influential and inspirational women in the world, and I couldn't agree more. She served as consultant for both the FDA and the World Health Organization, and she's co-author alongside with our mutual colleague, Dr. David Buss, of a book called Why Women Have Sex. And this is a book that's been translated into multiple languages and has fundamentally changed how scientists and the public think about women's sexuality and motivation. Today, we're going to be talking about why women have sex, how to improve the quality of your sex life, how to minimize the negative impact of stress on sex, and how to navigate and improve sexual function in perimenopause. We're also going to talk about how to navigate sexual desire when on birth control or antidepressants, and also how women can improve sexual well-being even if they've experienced sexual trauma. You are not going to want to miss this exciting conversation with Dr. Cindy Meston. This is the XX Lab. I'm Dr. Sarah Hill. Let's get started. Dr. Cindy Meston, welcome to the XX Lab.
Thank you. I am thrilled to be here. This is so exciting.
Well, this is so exciting. So Cindy and I were just talking off camera with the fact that I was actually one of her teaching assistants for her human sexuality class. Was it human sexuality or was it like human sexual psychology?
No, human sexuality. I've taught since the day I arrived.
Yeah. So I was her TA for human sexuality, and when I was at the University of Texas at Austin, and I've been following her career ever since because you are really kind of like the person when it comes to female sexuality. I mean, you have like laid so much groundwork in what we know about human sexuality, like when it comes to women, and the fact that that women's sexual psychology isn't the same as men's. And I want to just start by asking what got you interested in that? Like, how did you end up in this career area?
Yeah, well, thank you for that nice introduction. Really, it was by chance. I was in a completely different field. I went to college for fashion merchandising and design, and then dropped out, was in the sewing machine business. I was a Western Canadian sewing specialist for White Elna Sewing Machines, so I traveled 250 days a year putting on sewing seminars, and I had a little TV thing, Sewing and Surging with Cindy, and these radio shows where women would call in and say, I'm sewing with Ultrasaid and I've got skip stitches. What needle should I use? And I would give them the information. And anyways, I've been doing this for a number of years, and there's a longer version of the story. But I was dating someone at the time who was a nice fellow, but very boring. And I needed to, I should have gotten out of the relationship, but he made the best braised short ribs ever, and I couldn't imagine my life without those short ribs. So I thought, I can't leave this guy, so I have to, entertain myself. So just by chance, I signed up for a night school course in psychology at the University of British Columbia. I was living in Vancouver, Canada at the time, and it happened to be taught by a professor who studied serotonin and rat sexual behavior. And it was that night school class that I'm like, wow, I mean, I'd heard of Masters and Johnson, but, I really wasn't aware that people were actually conducting research about sexuality, and it just got me hooked. And here I am.
It's so crazy to me that you went from like talking to people about their skipped stitches to like creating an operational definition for female orgasm for the World Health Organization. It's like quite a leap.
From sewing to sex, yes, it's a bit of a leap.
From sewing to sex, yeah, I guess and Cindy sewing and sex. I like the alliteration on that.
There you go.
So you have, when it comes to the research that you've done with female sexuality, you've studied everything ranging from like the sexual response to sexual motivation to orgasm and everything in between. And so I want to start at the beginning and talk about desire, because that's usually the first thing that happens, and desire and motivation. And you published a really wonderful paper that talked about 4 different categories of cues that promote sexual desire. And I'm not going to just ask you to rattle them off, but rather I just want to have a conversation around like, what are the kinds of contexts, like what is female sexual desire, right? And what creates it? Like, what are the kinds of contexts that create female sexual desire?
Yeah, wow. Well, do we have like 3 hours? Because that's a very long question to answer. But so let me start with the beginning, which is how I conceptualize desire, different from arousal, because sometimes they get muddled together. I view desire as the motivation to engage in sex. So whether that is a thought, a fantasy, a dream, some visual cue, perhaps it's your partner that touches you in a way that makes you want to engage in sex, whereas arousal is when you're already in the situation. Do you feel turned on, and is your body responding? So in terms of desire, what we know about women is that there are 2 types of desire. And when we look at Masters and Johnson, and you see their sexual response cycle in any book that you look at, where desire precedes arousal, orgasm, resolution, this very linear idea that desire precedes arousal and is what starts the whole process in motion. And certainly that is the case some of the time, but that model better depicts male sexuality. Males are more visual, they're more attuned to visual cues, they're more likely to trigger sexual desire. Whereas women, a lot of times it's more responsive. So Rosemary Basson a number of years ago talked about this circular model of sexual desire in women as opposed to the linear Masters and Johnson model, whereby really desire can kick in at any time, and that many women really identify with this notion of responsive desire more than spontaneous desire. So they start out in kind of a neutral state, let's say, where they're kind of going to take it or leave it, but they're not averse to it, but they're not thinking about it. And maybe their partner says something nice, or maybe it touches them in a certain way, or maybe they clean the house for them, and all of a sudden they feel like, I feel turned on and I want to have sex. So this is where arousal is kind of pushing the drive. And so it's a sex difference in the sense that certainly women experience spontaneous desire, but it's more common in men. And as women age, we see that spontaneous desire lessens, likely to hormonal changes, which I'd love to talk to you about, and that more women talk about desire as being kind of fitting this more responsive pattern. So that's kind of like one whole big area. And then the other thing is that you asked is like, what triggers desire in women? And there's many different things, but I think one of the most important things to talk about is context. Context is so important for women. And, there's been a lot of really fascinating research that's come out of Kim Wallen's lab at Emory University in Atlanta, where he's done eye tracking studies, and he's looked at differences between men and women. So he presents an erotic scenario, let's say, and he gives the participants eye tracking, and he looks to see what they're looking at. And when you see the data for men, it's really fascinating. What do men look at? Breasts, genitals, breast, face, breast, genitals. And you give women an erotic picture, and what do they look at? Well, they're scanning the entire picture. They're trying to make sense of the scenario. They're figuring out the context, the story, like who are the players? What are their facial gestures? What does a background look like? Are the sheets at least 500 thread count before I'm willing to engage in this act? And so it's a big sex difference, because men are not as context dependent, which isn't to say context isn't important. I'm not making it to be like men and women are totally different. I'm just talking about general trends that for women to feel sexual desire, so many things have to be right. They have to be focused. They have to be attending to the sexual cues, and they're more distractible. Distractible by things like, is the house clean? Or have the children been fed? The work I have to do tomorrow. My partner wasn't very nice to me this morning, and I don't know if I feel like responding right now. So all of these things come into play, whereas men seem like they are much more, they have this spontaneous urge, and they're able to focus on it, and they're able to tune out distractions that would prevent them from wanting to engage in sexual activity. There's really, we can talk about all the reasons why is that, because that in and of itself is fascinating.
Yeah, it seems like, it's funny because I was having a conversation with my husband about, NFL has this thing called the Red Zone channel. I don't know if you know anything about football, American football, right? But the Red Zone channel is this thing, and I like watching football, but I need to see the whole thing. I need to see the full game. I need to understand the rivalry. I need to the whole thing. The Red Zone channel is just essentially touchdowns. So what they'll do is like of all the games that are going on, when people are in the end zone, all of a sudden they'll cut to the game. So it's just like a series of touchdowns. And to me, that's like the difference between male and female sexuality. It's like, I need the football game. I need to understand the dynamics between the two teams.
Absolutely.
Right. And then the touchdown is super satisfying to me. But having a touchdown that's totally devoid of context, I don't want anything to do with that.
Exactly. And, we see that in my lab. I, as you know, have a sexual psychophysiology laboratory. So we show erotic films, and we measure how aroused women become to the erotic films, both from a psychological or cognitive perspective and also genitally. And do 99% of my research is done in women. But at a time, I did have a male graduate student. And so we ventured into the male arena, and we were studying men. And we found we had to use very different erotic stimuli. In men, it was just like you could, put on the genital scene, and we would get great arousal. And for women, it was like, no, we had to use films made by women for women. We had to cut out certain shots. We had to make sure the actors, looked nice, and we had clean fingernails and nice lighting, and like all of those things in order to get our highest levels of arousal that you can hope to get in a laboratory setting, which of course isn't the ideal setting, but yeah.
Yeah, so you mentioned your female psychophysiology lab, which was right next door to the lab I was in graduate school. And a lot of the research that you all do, you're trying to better understand the female sexual response. And so you will give them, and my understanding was that you would insert a vaginal plethysmograph, which is so maybe you can tell us what that is and what it measures, and then what it has taught you all about the nature of female sexual arousal and what is all involved in female sexual arousal.
Sure. So maybe let me just clarify that when we talk about sexual arousal, we're talking about both the subjective or the cognitive experience of feeling turned on when you're in a sexual scenario, and then the bodily response or the physiological response, which in women is blood flow into the genitals. So women experience that as a fullness in the genitals, pulsing, throbbing of blood in the genitals, and it's highly correlated with vaginal lubrication. So as there's more blood in the genitals, there's actually pressure put on the cells that line the vagina, and that's what squeezes out the lubrication. So if you get blood in the genitals, you'll also get lubrication, assuming that hormones and everything else are acting as they should be. And so when we measure sexual arousal, we want to measure both of those components, of course. So to measure psychological arousal, for a long time, researchers, all we did is at the end of the erotic film, we simply asked them, how aroused were you to the film? And several other questions that tapped into how aroused are you right now after watching this film? We developed in my lab something a little bit better, which is a device that it's simply a computer mouse mounted to a rack fed into a computer program that allows us to monitor continuous sexual arousal. So we're not just measuring at the end of the movie, we're asking them as they're watching the movie, move this device forwards or backwards, indicating more or less arousal, and you can even go into the turn off zone. So we're really able to see how they're feeling throughout the film. And there's many scenes in the film, so some women may like this scene and not the other scene, and so this way you get a much better picture of what's going on psychologically. Now, genitally, we use a device called a vaginal photoplethysmograph, and this is a small tampon-shaped acrylic device that the woman inserts into her vagina in the privacy of the testing room. And it emits a light into the vagina, and it measures the amount of light reflected back. So in women, as you have more blood in the genitals, the walls of the vagina are denser, more light is absorbed, and you get a higher level of arousal indicated. And so it's a pretty good measure of how much blood is in the genitals, and so it's a good indication of arousal. And so to get an idea of how aroused a woman is, we show a sequence of films. First, we show just a non-sexual film, like a travel film. We called it a neutral film for maybe 3 minutes to get their baseline level of arousal, because there's always some blood in the genitals, so you have to know where you're starting from, right? And then immediately following that, we show the erotic film, which is 3 to 5 minutes. And we look at the change between how much blood was in the vagina when they're watching the neutral film to how much blood is in the vagina when they're watching the erotic film. So that difference gives us an indicator of change or genital sexual arousal. And then we can look to see how that compares with what they're saying, how aroused or not aroused they were. And we look at correlations between the two. And then, of course, you can have many different testing sessions. You can do that if you're doing a drug study. In one session, you give them a drug. Another session, you give them placebo or whatever the case is. And you have, randomized sessions where you look at the differences in changes between the sessions.
So when you're measuring both physiological arousal by looking at blood flow into the vagina, and then also asking people about their subjective responses, are these things always related? And if so, why? If not, why not?
Yeah. You're asking the question that I have spent about 30 years trying to figure out. Super fascinating, I think, and a really interesting gender difference, because when we bring men into the laboratory and we measure their subjective arousal and we measure their genital arousal, so to do this, we use a strain gauge. It fits over the penis and it basically measures blood flow into the penis. And we look at the correspondence between how aroused they are and the strength of their erection. Basically, we get very close correlations, not just in my lab, but across studies, you get correlations of about 0.9, which, as you know, in psychology, crazy high, right? You never get that
crazy
high. So it's this really, really close connection between what their genitals are doing and how aroused they say they are. Okay, so now we bring women into the laboratory and we do the same thing. And what do we get across studies? We get correlations of about 0.23. And there's vast variability between women. On some women, there's really strong concordance, and some women, there's very low concordance. And, this, in a nutshell, is why we have so many drugs approved by the FDA for men and really very few for women. I mean, now there's a few that act on central mechanisms, but, Viagra, I started testing Viagra in 1998. That's when Pfizer introduced it to the male market, and all of the pharmaceutical companies were trying to jump on the bandwagon to be the first to develop the pink Viagra. And because I was the only one with a psychophys testing lab at the time, I did the initial Viagra studies in women. What did we find? Absolutely. Viagra works the same way in women as it does in men through nitric oxide mechanisms. It gets blood flowing into the genitals. But big difference where the men said, oh, wow, this is fantastic. I've got like an erection I haven't had since I was 20. Let's have sex. Women, yeah, there's blood in the genitals. Some of them said, oh, great, yeah, this turns me on. Some of them didn't even notice the change, and for others, they noticed it, but it didn't play into their desire to have sex. So again, this gets back to, men are more tuned in to their erections. They're more focused on their erections. I mean, overall, the psychophys literature shows that men are better judges of physiological changes than women. Whether that's because women are, kind of nurtured or developmentally, or we are scanning our environment. We're trying to get along. We're trying to make sure everything's okay. We're more nurturing, all those sorts of things. Or it's also just pure anatomical differences. The male erectile response is out there. When a man has an erection, he notices it. It grabs his attention. Whereas women, it's much subtler. It's easier to ignore. So I think anatomy plays into it somewhat. But then it gets back to this notion of context. It's not just the genital response that is making women want to have sex. There's other things at play that feed in. There's many more pieces of the pie that constitute her overall subjective experience of arousal. Whereas for men, I think a big piece of that pie is what their penis is doing.
Do you have a hypothesis? No, it's perfect.
Teaching is way too long.
No, I mean it makes perfect sense. I mean, because that was the first thing I thought of is like, well, of course, like when you're a man, you have this like bona fide, like right in front of
yes,
you.
No pun intended.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like it's just more obvious and than it is for women. But what do you have a hypothesis about? Or are there any differences that you've noticed between women who have strong concordance versus those who have weak concordance? Like do you know, like what is accounting for that variance, like between women?
Yeah, we don't know. I can say there's been very little study research looking at that particular question. We looked in my lab to see whether it predicted like sexual dysfunction or not. It wasn't a great predictor. It is, I mean, when there is concordance between the two, if women, I mean, a lot of the movement now is, this sort of mindfulness about sex, and it's really just teaching women to focus on their genital cues. And that has shown to help women who have sexual arousal difficulties. Now, Why is it helping? I think part of it, if you're attending to those genital cues, then you're not focused on something else. You know, if you are intentionally focused on what your genitals are doing, how the sensations feel, by thinking that, oh, this feels good, this is an indicator that I'm into it, then that keeps you from thinking about all these performance-related issues. You're like, oh, how does my butt look? Is my partner judging my body? Oh, I've gained weight. Oh, I better suck my stomach in. You know, all of these sorts of things that distract women from being in the moment, and consequently, I think negatively impact arousal. But getting back to your question, yeah, we don't know what that variability is. I think there's, you know, and you've talked about this in your book, that there's just huge individual variability between women. And we certainly see this in sexual arousal, not only what turns them on, but the degree to which genital cues play an important role in how aroused they feel. And, you know, especially I've been more and more involved in the menopausal side of things in research. And, you know, for a lot of women, when hormones change and estrogen declines and consequently vaginal lubrication declines, in addition to causing sex to be painful, which of course, or uncomfortable, which of course is going to make it less desirable. But independent of that, the loss of those genital feelings and genital responses have a very deleterious effect on women's overall psychological experience of arousal, of how they experience it. But for some women, it doesn't have an effect. For some women, it does, and you see, you know, Lorraine Dennerstein is a researcher at Melbourne University in Australia, and she's done some of the most phenomenal longitudinal research on menopausal women. She did something like followed women from pre to peri postmenopause for like a decade or longer, and looked at how desire changes across the menopausal transition. And she found that, and don't quote me on the exact percentages, it was a long time ago that I read this number, but let's just say almost half of the women, it really didn't change all that much. And then you had, you know, maybe 40% of the women, there was a decrease in drive with menopause. And then there was a smaller percentage, 10, 15%, that actually showed an increase in drive with menopause. And so Dr. Dennerstein decided to follow up and see, well, who are these women who show an increase? This is interesting. And there were a number of predictors, but the biggest predictor was they got a new sexual partner. And so, you know, I'm not suggesting that if you're a menopausal woman and your desire is low that you leave your partner and find someone else, but it does play into the whole idea of novelty being important in sex drive for men and women. And, you know, it's also true that the length of the relationship is a negative predictor of sexual desire in a relationship. You know, things become routine. You fall into a pattern that's worked for the last 10 years, so why change it, you know? And yeah, so sorry, I'm going
No,
off.
I think that's I think that's fascinating. I actually, you know, I read a paper. This was a couple of years ago. Now I don't remember who the authors were, but it was a really lovely paper where it was looking at the effects of long-term monogamous relationships on sexual desire in men and women. And the sort of surprising result was that monogamy and long-term relationships are harder on women than men, just in terms of sexual desire. And which to me, you know, when I was interpreting it, I was thinking that it has to do with the sex differences in spontaneous versus, you know, responsive sexual desire, probably. Just because when men experience spontaneous sexual desire, which for listeners who aren't familiar with that, that's kind of sexual desire that almost comes out of nowhere, kind of like hunger or, you know, feeling tired, where it's just like, you know, apropos of nothing, all of a sudden you want a sandwich, or, you know, apropos of nothing, you just, you know, want to have sex. And men have more of that, right? And so even if they're in a long-term relationship, which might have some of these contextual cues that are related to familiarity and having to do the laundry and all of the other things that women's sexuality tends to be really sensitive to, that men continue to have robust, sexual response kind of throughout the lifetime because they experience spontaneous sexual desire more frequently than women. And that for women whose sexuality is so cued into context, that routine and lack of novelty could be potentially more impairing. And so that was the way I interpreted that result. And yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I do think that's a big part of it. And I mean, novelty, as you know, from an evolutionary perspective, is very important for male sexuality as well. I mean, the literature would say more so than for women. But, I just think the predictability of sex, again, getting back to, women are very much tuned into emotional bonding cues, but also romantic cues. And, the longer you're in a relationship, you just kind of forget to do those special little things. So sometimes it can be as simple as putting a surprise note in, your partner's briefcase or whatever, or just little things to keep it fresh and exciting. And like, women want to feel valued and appreciated, and they want to feel attractive. And yeah, so
do you think, speaking of that, like, especially for women as they're aging and going through perimenopause and the menopausal transition, and and we do generally see that sexual desire takes a hit, and there are good explainable hormonal reasons for this, but there's also, I think, just changes in the way that women experience their own bodies and the way that they feel about themselves that can really play an important role in those hits. And so what, do you have, based on the research that you've done, do you have any recommendations, in addition to doing things to increase and fuel novelty within the relationship and, kind of keep things sexy? What are some of the things do you think that women can do to change their sort of self-narrative in a way that's going to be help fuel sexual desire later in life?
Yeah. Well, funny you should ask that, because I just suggested one of my graduate students do her dissertation on that. And we did a preliminary study. What we're getting at here are sexual schemas. Schemas are representations of how you view yourself as a sexual being. And I've done a fair amount of research in this with respect to sexual abuse survivors, women who are sexual abuse survivors, and how that impacts their sexual schema in a negative way. And what we looked at in menopausal women is, what are their sexual schemas? How do they feel about themselves as a sexual being as they transition from fertility to no longer fertile? And we found that there were many different subgroups, and both positive and negative schema change. So there was the predictable negative schema change, which is, well, I feel like less of a woman. Motherhood was important to me, and my body has changed. I don't feel I'm as attractive. So all of these negative schema changes. But then there are also some women who had very positive schema changes, which were things like, oh, now I have more freedom. The kids are gone. We have more time and money. We can do fun things. We can plan romantic events. There's more time for spontaneity. And I feel like, we get to reconnect and rediscover each other. So I think a lot of how a woman fares psychologically through menopause has to do with the schemas that she brings to her whole concept of sexuality. I mean, for someone who very much their sexuality is tied to reproduction, well, they're going to be hit hard For someone like myself who's never wanted kids in her life, and who at the age of 24 marched into my doctor's office and said, I want my tubes tied and I'm never having kids. And he said, there's no way, you'll change your mind. Absolutely. All women do, and you'll want to have kids. And I'm like, no, I won't. Yes, you will. No, I won't. Yes, you will. No, I will. And we awfully argued. And here I am years later and never had kids, never wanted kids. And happy I never had kids. And so reproduction is not part of my sexual psyche at all. So it didn't even, faze me. But
right. Can women rewrite their schemas? So is there something that women can do? Because I do think that a lot of us, and even if it's not tied to motherhood, right, where it's just like tied to this ideal that, and evolutionarily, we understand why tends to be a greater value placed on women who have cues related to fertility, and we tend to see those things as beautiful. Like, how do we rewrite that in a way that's positive for our own sexuality?
Well, I did a study a number of years ago on a writing intervention study. This was done on women survivors of sexual abuse. It was a very involved study. It took 6 years. It was an NIH-funded study. And I had 100 women who were very severely sexually abused in childhood and were experiencing sexual dysfunction in adulthood. And I got them into a writing intervention program. So writing, just basically journaling. And I had 3 groups. In one group, the women simply wrote about their day. That's the standard control for a writing intervention. In the second group, they wrote about their trauma. And Jamie Pennybaker, he's written books on this. He's done fabulous research. He's shown how writing can have a tremendous impact on psychology in terms of trauma survivors, depression, anxiety, and so forth. So I had a third of the women write about their trauma. Then the third group was unique to my study, and my goal was to really tap into what their sexual schemas were. So I had this guided intervention where their prompt would be, I want you to write about how you view yourself as a sexual person. How did you get there? How did you, what does this mean to your overall? So there's all these prompts. And I had them write, I'd have to go back to the original study, but it was short. I want to say 20 minutes. It wasn't a long writing intervention. And they did it, I think, 3 times a week for a number of weeks. And then we followed up at a month, 3 months, and 6 months. And honestly, I was so surprised with the findings. I was hoping for significance. I got a tremendous effect. The women who wrote about the trauma and the women who wrote about their sexual schemas both showed significant decreases in depression, anxiety, and PTSD symptoms. But here's the really interesting part. It was only the women who wrote about their sexual schemas that also improved in sexual dysfunction. So all of the women in that group at the start met clinical criteria, diagnosed by a clinician, blind to controls, met criteria for severe sexual dysfunction, and by the end of the study, less than half of them met criteria. So it was not only statistically, but really clinically meaningful and significant. So I was delighted with the findings, because this is just writing. You don't need a therapist. It cuts across all demographics, socioeconomic status. It costs nothing to write. Anyone could do this. And so the study that my graduate student actually is about to embark upon is taken from this, and it is to get women who are menopausal, who are struggling with their sexuality, to look into their sexual schemas and to write about who they are as a sexual person, how they viewed themselves as a sexual person, prior to menopause, how they feel now, what changed. Like, just writing about this is so therapeutic. And nobody knows really why it is, but I think part of it is when something's bothering you, or when you're upset about something, whether it's you've gained weight or you've lost your fertility or whatever it is, it's just a thought that's just there. It keeps going round and round. But when you're forced to put it on paper, it's like there's a beginning and a middle and an end. Yeah, I used to be fertile and I felt this way, and now it affected me, and why did I? And somehow it just resolves in their mind. Oh, well, yeah, but I'm still me. So I think that's a part, could be very helpful. Another whole part of it really is body image, and as women's bodies change, how they feel about their body. And we know from the literature that there is a really meaningless relationship between a woman's actual body and how she feels about her body. The correlation is terrible. It does not predict whatsoever. And it's independent of BMI. Research has shown this. And so, we're all exposed to media and magazines and models, and we all know that. And, but we still are on social media looking at all of these things, and they just make you feel lousy about yourself. And so I hate social media. I try to stay off of it. It never makes me feel good. I do have an Instagram account because I'm told I should have one. But I rarely post. I'm just posting science most of the time. I don't like doing the videos or whatever. But so, trying to, Eric Stice is a researcher in the field of eating disorders, which of course body image is a major player there. And he's done some important work called the Body Project. And part of what was successful about that, again, is he got women to write about their bodies, write a letter to, your thighs or to your body, and thank your body for, all the abuse at this age that we've put it through. And, we're still standing and it's still doing this for me and that, and just kind of show gratitude for your body and what it does do, instead of, well, it doesn't look like it looked when I was 20, so these are kind of self-help interventions, Yeah,
I think that these writing interventions are so powerful. And I'm glad that you brought up the study that you did on the writing intervention with the women who had suffered sexual trauma. I thought that was such a wonderful study. And it really is such a hopeful message. I'll have a link to the study in the show notes for those of you who want to see the specific intervention, because it really is something that you can do at home. And I do know that there are so many women who've experienced some sort of sexual trauma of one type or another. And, finding that there is something that they can do to try to shift their sexual psychology in a way that feels healthy for them, I think is a really great message. And I love the idea of applying these same interventions to menopausal, perimenopausal women, because it makes sense, right? That you have this complex set of, psychological mechanisms in your head that are linked with your psychology, and then your beliefs about yourself and how you feel about yourself and things that have happened in the past. And just having an opportunity to get all of the stress, sort of out there on paper, I think can be incredibly therapeutic in so many different ways.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to really quickly, speaking of stress, I want to talk about, and I know this is one of your most cited studies, is about stress and sexual response. And this was early. So this is probably, this is earlier career, because I remember you talking about this when I was your TA back in 2003 or whatever this was. But it was about looking at, we tend to think about stress as being bad for sexual desire. Right. And stress, and generally it is, right? Like chronic stress. And we talked about the fact that women's sexual desire is so contextual. But you had some work early on showing that mild levels of physiological arousal, right? Yeah. Which can, oftentimes sort of occur in a mildly stressful type of a context, can potentially actually be positive when it comes to sexual desire. So talk us through that. What's going on there? And is there a way that we can harness that for promoting sexual desire?
Yes, absolutely. So I think what you're referring to are my early exercise studies,
Yes.
where I had women run on a treadmill or ride on an exercise bike for 20 minutes at 70% of their maximum heart rate to either exercise or not exercise before viewing the films. And then I looked to see is there a difference, and wow, was there ever a difference? When women exercised prior to viewing the films, we got over 150% increase in the amount of blood flowing to genitals. And just stepping back a bit, the reason I decided to do those studies was so much of what we knew about women's sexuality when I started my career, actually I started studying it as an undergrad, so like way back in 1990, was based on a male template. And that's partly because funding agencies at the time were not willing to support women's sexuality research, but they were willing to put money into reproductive function. So because a male needs to have an erection and ejaculate, not really, but whatever. They were willing, we learned a lot about male physiology, but women, reproduction, they don't have to have desire, they don't have to have arousal, they don't have to have an orgasm, they just have to have functional ovaries. So all the money was put into ovarian function. So we knew very little about it. So we were reliant on the male literature. That was the main thing. And then the second thing is, scientists assume that because in the womb we all start from undifferentiated tissue, and the same tissue that develops into a clitoris or penis or scrotum or labia, that, same tissue, it must all act the same. So there was this assumption that sexual arousal was facilitated by the parasympathetic nervous system. And just for the listeners out there who don't know this, our nervous system, there's two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And the sympathetic is the one that's active when you're anxious. It gets a fight or flight response. It gets you moving. And the parasympathetic is restorative. So it kind of does the opposite. That's a very simplistic picture. They're actually really work together in really complicated ways. But anyways, it was assumed that arousal was parasympathetic dominant, and so women who had trouble getting aroused, they were told to have a bubble bath, calm down, listen to quiet music, relax, breathe. And it never made sense to me because, when you're in sexual arousal, your heart's racing, all these things are going on. And then you hear people, when I have a good fight, I have the best sex I ever had afterwards. So like when people were anxious and aroused, there's all these indications that sexual arousal was being facilitated. So I used exercise as a clean way of activating the sympathetic nervous system without changing, cognition negatively or positively. And so we did find, and it's been replicated many, many times now, that exercise or sympathetic activation before sex facilitates blood into the vagina, which is sexual arousal in women. Now, you said stress, and as long as there can be a cognitive shift, if you know what I mean. Like when someone's stressed out and angry and their sympathetic nervous system, and their partner approaches them, they may well punch them, and sex is the last thing on their mind. But if they're aroused for something and then all of a sudden their partner starts doing something that feels good, and they're able to do this excitation transfer, right? It's such that their anger response or their stress response is transferred over to the sexual realm, then that is going to facilitate arousal. So, forget this bubble bath stuff. And I tell people, no, just like chase your partner around the block, or, even go to a scary movie. Or I did a roller coaster study. I got people to ride the roller coaster. So do something activating. And I think this could be particularly helpful for menopausal women who don't want to be on hormone replacement therapy, that this is a way that you can get your body pumped up and prepared for sexual arousal that doesn't require any pharmaceutical intervention.
Yeah, it's like it's potentiating, right? Like
Yeah.
I think about and yeah, when I said stress, I was thinking like physiological stress. So I was thinking
Yeah,
kind
yeah.
of broadly, but
Yes.
I think it is such an interesting, I think it is so interesting, the contrast, because there is that whole bubble bath, that you just like need to rose petals and soft music, and it's like
Yeah,
people
yeah.
don't. People, they play thumping bass music at a nightclub where people go to hook up for a reason. They're not
Yes,
playing
yes, yes,
chimes
yes,
and, doing a
yeah.
Buddhist chant.
It-
Like you're more likely to hook up at the club or when you're at the gym.
Absolutely.
And I do
Absolutely.
think, yeah, there's such a great message there, because it's like, we know that exercise is good for a lot of different reasons, and
Yeah.
there's so many benefits that we
Yeah.
get from exercise, especially as we begin to get older, and that the fact that this can also facilitate sexual desire is just another one. And it's not even, I think that sometimes people think that it's just going to be about the way that they feel about their body, which it also helps. Right.
Yeah.
But then,
Yeah.
as you noted, just like really getting the blood going is going to really facilitate sexual response, which is so important, especially, like I said, as women get older.
Absolutely. I think what you're referring to is there's both the chronic benefits of exercise and the acute effects. And we all know the chronic effects. It keeps you fit, it keeps you flexible, keeps your body toned, it gives you the endorphins, you feel better on mood, all those things. But in addition to all of those things, there's just the acute effect that activate the sympathetic nervous system within about, it's a pretty short window, so about 15 minutes prior to having sex. Then it is going to facilitate the genital response for women.
That's great. And so I want to talk now with you about birth control and antidepressants. And these are
Okay.
two things that we know, in part from some of the research that you've done, can be not necessarily great for the female sexual response.
Yeah.
And so let's start by talking about hormonal birth control. And I'm really interested in having you tell our listeners about the research that you did looking at female sexual response in response to hormonal birth control and why that happened.
Yeah, well, you're the expert on this. So I did do a study a number of years ago where we had women who were on different types of hormonal birth control. So we divided them into two different groups. Those women who were on hormonal birth control that didn't significantly impact SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin. And that's the thing that sticks to testosterone, binds to testosterone, and lowers testosterone. And then the other women, so we had two different types of birth control, those that really decreased testosterone and those that didn't. We brought them in the laboratory. We did a number of different measurements. We measured their desire and arousal across time, and then we also measured their actual genital responses in the laboratory. And indeed, we found that the women who were on the hormonal birth control pills that that we know significantly blocks testosterone, they showed lower desire, lower arousal, but they also, in a laboratory setting, in an actual controlled setting, viewing a film, they had lower levels of blood flow into their genitals compared to women who were not on those birth control pills. So yeah, it's a meaningful difference. And you spell out so wonderfully in your book how this affects mate selection and mood and all of it, so many things. Yeah, it's
So with antidepressants, we also know that this is a context where a lot of women can experience decreases in sexual desire and changes in the sexual response, right? Where they get diminished vaginal lubrication and can experience sexual dysfunction. And I know that you've done some research on different types of interventions for sexual dysfunction in the context of SSRIs. And I'm just wondering if you could tell listeners, like, what do we actually know and not know about what SSRIs do to women's
Right.
sexual functioning? And then is there anything that they can do? And same with for women on hormonal birth control. Like I know that you didn't study that specifically. You know, there was no targeted intervention there, but do you have any thoughts about what might potentially help in that context as well?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take the hormonal birth control one first. Well, honestly, like change birth controls. Go on a birth control that doesn't block testosterone or that has the least effect on altering your hormones. You know, would be my advice on that one. You probably have some better insight into that.
And I'm going to post, I just want to interrupt really quickly to say, I'm going to post on the show notes links to this paper, which talks about the different levels of testosterone blocking effects of these different types of birth control, and sort of give you all who are listening a picture of the different degrees to which different types of hormonal birth control have that effect. Because I think that what you're saying is very, wise, right? It's like if you want to be on hormonal birth control, like then, and you're experiencing this effect, then switch what you're on, right? Like there's still that option.
Right,
and
exactly. You're young, you've got lots of time to figure it out. If it's not working for you, try something else.
Right, and so antidepressants.
Antidepressants, So what do we know about antidepressants? Well, it's sort of based on the belief that, and we don't know this for sure, but we have a good inkling that serotonin mechanisms are involved in depression. And so when antidepressants first started, the first generation of antidepressants, they just gave you a whopping bunch of serotonin that hit all the serotonin receptors in your brain. Now, I don't recall exactly how many have now been identified. I want to say probably 7 or more receptor subtypes, serotonin receptor subtypes. So there's like a 1, a 1A, a 1B, a 1C, a 2, 2A, 2B. And what we know from the animal research, which was actually my very first job as a lab assistant, was working in a rat lab, counting ear wiggling behaviors, which is a measure of proceptivity in female rats, to try to identify which antidepressants led to what serotonergic effect. But anyways, so we know that there are many different serotonin receptor subtypes, and some of them, if you hit if the serotonin molecule hits it, it facilitates sexual behavior, others inhibit, and some have no effect. So the first generation of serotonin acting antidepressants, they just went everywhere. You didn't know what they were hitting. And then over the years, the pharmaceutical companies have gotten better and better and better. Now, SSRI, what does that stand for? Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So they're selectively picking the subtype of serotonin receptors that don't impair sexual function. Because we know the two big reasons why women stop taking antidepressants, even if they're very effective in alleviating depression, is they cause sexual side effects and they cause weight gain. So the newer generation of antidepressants are better in the sense that they have a lower incidence of sexual side effects. Now, again, it's very frustrating, however, because, again, getting back to this individual variability, what may work for one woman just beautifully may cause another woman intense sexual difficulties. And this could be anything from just disinterest in sex, a low sex drive, or an inability to become aroused, or an inability to have an orgasm, or, all three. They often coexist. And so we don't know why that is. People are just so wonderfully and frustratingly unique that it's hard to find a solution that works for everybody. So for women who are on antidepressants and are experiencing sexual side effects, what's generally suggested is, you can add something like buspirone to it. So you add another drug to it that will compensate. That's helpful for some women. You take a break. Well, that's not so great because, these effects are cumulative over time. Or again, you try another antidepressant. That one's more frustrating than the birth control because it's often, takes several weeks to see the effect of it. But that is an option to try a different antidepressant that, just may not hit those receptors in you and not cause the sexual side effects. One of my graduate students did a wonderful dissertation on looking at women who were on antidepressant drugs experiencing negative sexual side effects and using exercise as an intervention. And she looked at both, was it chronic exercise that was doing the effect, or was it acute? And what we found, indeed, it was the acute exercise for those women who are having difficulty becoming aroused. When they exercised prior to sex, it compensated for some of for the suppression of sexual arousal. And now, if you look at the different types of antidepressants, you have the SNRIs, selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, and SSRIs. And so one class of those actually suppresses sympathetic nervous system activity when it's acting on norepinephrine. That's the sympathetic system. And so our hypothesis was, well, maybe in some women, the reason they're experiencing side effects is that the antidepressants, in addition to doing the serotonin thing, they're also suppressing the sympathetic nervous system. And if women exercise before sex, that will compensate for that. And indeed, we got really interesting results that they showed a much greater sexual arousal response, even on the antidepressants, when they exercise before sex. And the women who were on antidepressants that had the biggest suppression of sympathetic nervous system activity, they were the ones experiencing the greatest level of side effects, sexual side effects.
Here's what I want to know. We've been talking about sexual function, which I feel like we need to talk about orgasms. And I love that we have the opportunity to talk about orgasms with you, because you actually helped the World Health Organization develop a definition, an operational definition of the female orgasm. And so I want to know, one, why did the World Health Organization want a definition for female orgasm at all? And what is it? And then I want to dive a little bit into the female orgasm, because it is a little bit elusive sometimes. So
right.
So what is your definition? Why did the World Health Organization want it?
This is a international organization. It has many, it's like the International Urological Society. It's many different things, and then that meet every 5 years, and they decide that we need to define blah. And that year it was sexual function. And so for 2 years, I was the chair of Women's Orgasm Committee. And so for 2 years, I picked my committee. I had some wonderful team members. And we read everything that was ever written about orgasm to try to come up with a definitive definition. So that could be used by NIH, other research fundings, by the medical society at large, so that we're all kind of talking about the same thing. And you asked me what it is. I could not. It is so long. It's such a long... We tried to make it the most concise as possible, and it's still a large paragraph long that one of my colleagues says that it takes longer to read my definition of orgasm than it does to have one. And so it's long, and it's a definition that involves, all of the body physiology in addition to feelings of euphoria and well-being and all of the good things that go along with it.
One of the things that I find so interesting about when we look at human sexuality and we look at differences between the sexes is that, for men, orgasm is almost like a given, right? It's like if a man is having sex, then it's just assumed that he's going to have an orgasm, and if he doesn't, it seems like a problem. And then for women, it's more elusive. And in fact, I read a study showing that forget what the percentages were, and you might know them or you might not remember them off the top of your head, but there's a significant portion of the population of women that doesn't have orgasms all that frequently at all. And I'm really interested in understanding, like, I want to know whether you have thoughts about why we have sex differences in the ease of like orgasmic ability, and whether the definitions, I think that culturally we tend to think about satisfying sex. Everybody assumes that it's synonymous with having lots of orgasms. And I think when we look at female sexuality, I don't think that tells that story at all. And I'm really curious about this. What are your thoughts about the differences in the ease with which men and women experience orgasm, and what are your thoughts about how we define good, quality sexual activity?
Yeah. Well, let me start off by saying that there has never been identified anything physiologically wrong, I hate to use that term, with women who can't have an orgasm. Okay, so I mean, except in extreme conditions, of course, if there's severe diabetes or nerve damage, but I'm talking in the absence of that. So it's not like women who are able to have an orgasm have been distinguished from women who can't have an orgasm because they don't have enough hormone or their clitoris isn't working right, or it's not, like, none of that. It's really, really very simple. If you look at the literature, why is it that women who are educated are more likely to have an orgasm? Why is it that everybody talks about men peaking in their 20s and women peaking in their 30s? Why is it that older women are more likely to have an orgasm than younger women? It's sexual experience. Why does religious inhibition and shame impair orgasm? All of these things. It's like you have to learn to have an orgasm. You really do. Now, men don't, because their penis is sticking out there and they get friction, and it's like a very simple maneuver to have an orgasm. But with women, I mean, not the younger generation, but in my generation, we were taught to, like, don't touch down there, like it's some sort of biohazard zone. And so women didn't know where their genitals were or how to pleasure themselves. There's a vast difference in masturbation rates between men and women. Still, there always has. And in fact, one of the most interesting findings, I think, is if you look at the Kinsey report way back in the 50s, Kinsey asked questions about everything. There was massive sex differences. Men had more orgasms, had more sex, more casual sex, more affairs, more, you name it, they had more. And then if you look across the decades to other large-scale surveys, like the Lauman report out of the University of Chicago, and I think it was 1999, the Height report, big-scale studies across the decade, what we see is a narrowing of that gap in that, okay, more women are having affairs, one-night stands, multiple sexual partners, all these things. So, was it in the Kinsey time that they really weren't that there really was this big sex difference, or that women just didn't feel comfortable admitting to it? We'll never know. But regardless, over the decade, those sex differences have narrowed on almost everything except masturbation rates. Okay, there is still this vast difference. Now, a lot of people would argue, well, that lends itself or argues for sex differences in sex drive between men and women, biological underlying differences. But it's also the case that women don't masturbate as much. And so they more women don't know their bodies. They don't feel comfortable. They haven't taken the time to do that. They're embarrassed or shy, or for religious reasons or other reasons, they've just never explored. And then they've got in a relationship, and if they're not with a partner who's really spending a lot of time figuring out what feels good, then, they may never achieve orgasm. And even among women who are orgasmic, who are able to have an orgasm on a regular basis, only something like 60% of those women can have an orgasm during partnered sex. Okay. And so why is that? Well, because probably there's many reasons. One is they may be distracted. Again, they're focused on their partner's pleasure, or they're focused on their body image or what's going on, so they're not attending to the sexual cues. But even more likely is they're not getting the stimulation that they need in order to attain an orgasm. And in order to attain an orgasm, you have to have high enough levels of arousal. And for most women, that involves clitoral stimulation. And that's where the greatest number of nerve endings are in a woman. That's comparable to the head of the penis. As we develop, the clitoris develops and the penis develops. And it's that's why for men, it's also easier to have an orgasm. They're getting direct stimulation where the most nerve endings are. So if a woman is having intercourse and isn't getting clitoral stimulation sufficient, she's not going to have an orgasm. And so most women who engage in masturbation involve some sort of clitoral stimulation, and that allows them to more easily have an orgasm. I'll just tell you kind of an interesting story. Freud did a real number on women when he still women are suffering the consequences of him saying there's two types of orgasm: the mature orgasm, which is the vaginal orgasm, and the infantile orgasm, which is the clitoral orgasm. And then Masters and Johnson took people into the lab, measured the responses, and found the exact same thing without without having a sensation of a penis inside you. Everything else is the same. The heart rate, blood pressure, all the things that change during orgasm, it's the same, whether it's via clitoral stimulation or intercourse, vaginal penetration. But so a lot of women still think that if they can't have an orgasm during intercourse, there's something wrong with them. Okay, so going back to this interesting anecdote, the great niece of Napoleon Bonaparte, I think it was a great niece, she was a physician. What was her name? Josephine, I think. And she was hanging out with Freud, so he probably messed her up big time. And she was very concerned because she couldn't have an orgasm during intercourse. And she believed that, she was not experiencing of the greatest pleasure that a woman should be able to experience. And so she figured out that it had to do with the placement of her clitoris. And she speculated that women whose clitoris was further away from the vaginal opening were less likely to have a vaginal orgasm. And so she went about actually measuring the distance between a number of women and whether or not they were orgasmic. And of course, in the day, we didn't have the stats or anything to do it. But she concluded that, yes, this played into it. And she subsequently underwent surgeries to have her clitoris move closer to her vaginal opening, which of course is a terrible thing to do and just destroys sensory nerves. But the follow-up to that is not that long ago, I want to say for sure in the last decade, again, Kim Wallen's lab at Emory University got hold of her original data and using advanced statistics did the actual stats on it and found, yes, indeed, if the distance, I think it was 2.5 centimeters, the width of a thumb, if the distance between, and they looked between the urethral opening, because that's an easier measurement than the vaginal opening, the urethra and the clitoris, and if the distance was less than the width of a thumb, a woman is more likely to come.
That's awesome. And, it's really consistent with, I was reading some studies looking at, it was like twin studies, and, that you tend to find that female orgasm runs in families. And I was trying to gross out my mom And so I sent her this article, and it was talking about the heritability of female orgasm within families. And I was trying to gross out my mom, and I'm like, thanks, Mom. And then she like came back with my pleasure.
Okay, she's got a good sense of humor. I like your mom.
I was like, touche, Mom. Like, I was trying to gross you out, and now you grossed me out. But anyway,
funny. That's good.
Yeah. So it does seem like there's a lot of individual differences, and it could just be, these simple anatomical differences. And so for women who, because I've heard from women who have difficulty having orgasm, and then like you said, they feel like there's something wrong with them, or they feel like there's something wrong with their sex life. And then I've heard some women who are like what's the big deal? like I don't have an orgasm all the time, and it doesn't bother me. So why is everybody else so wound up about it? And so I guess is it possible for women to have a good sex life based on all the observations you have for your years of research, without having orgasms frequently? Like, is that how we need to be defining what good sex is? Or
no, absolutely not. At the end of the day, it's sexual pleasure that matters. And again, sexual pleasure is different for every woman. For some women, it may be all about orgasms, but honestly, particularly as women age, sexual pleasure has a lot to do with feeling understood, bonding, connecting, feeling like this person cares about me and we're in it together. Like all of those, very evolutionarily based emotional bonding cues play more and more of a role. And also, as Rosemary Basson wrote about in her model, the circular model of sexual response I referred to earlier, she talks about the spin-offs. And so for many women, it's the sexual pleasure isn't even about the sex part. It's about what comes after sex, which is the cuddling and the closeness and the relaxation and the feeling like you've shared an intimate moment. It has nothing to do with the sex act. It's the spin-offs of what come from that. I'll just mention one thing. There's a book that was written by my postdoctoral supervisor and who was the director of the Kinsey Institute for many years, Dr. Julia Hyman, Heiman, and Hyman and Rowland, and it's very old, but you can still buy it, and it's called Directed Masturbation. I think that's what it's called. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. And it's a very simple paperback book. It basically guides women in self-exploration of their body. I know there's other books that have come since and done, similar things. This was the original one, and this is the only one where there has been very rigorous science on. In fact, our conclusion of that whole 2-year-long process of studying orgasm, our conclusion was the only empirical treatment for orgasm difficulties in women is directed masturbation. And again, it's cheap.
Makes
like
perfect sense.
$10 or something. You don't have to spend thousands of dollars on therapy. You don't have to wonder what's wrong with you or what in your past is preventing you from having an orgasm. No, it's
practice makes perfect, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you think that there's, and I had read, gosh, I don't remember if it was an animal study or if it was just an old school human study, where they were looking about reinforcement. So we look at, like the dopamine sort of reward response where it like increased, like where you get a reward, your brain rewards you in a way that leads you to want to do it again. Does orgasm have the same effect on the reward response of men and women?
Oh, I don't know. But
what were you getting excited about?
Oh, I thought you were going to say, no, I mean, just the role of dopamine is super interesting. And there
Mhm,
are some brain imaging studies looking
mhm,
at women with sexual problems, without sexual problems, in
mhm,
dopaminergic rich areas of the brain, which shows some evidence that there may be a difference. Of course, the FDA approved drug Addy
mhm.
acts on dopamine systems in the brain. So, yes, the idea here is to make sex more rewarding, and then you're going to want to have it more. But the interesting thing in the literature is women with low sex drive, it's not like they're not having orgasm. They're having
Right.
orgasms, they're enjoying their orgasms, but it's just like, okay, I'm good for a month or two or a year.
Yeah,
Like
I've always
it's not rewarding enough to make them want to have it more.
I've always hypothesized, and the reason I asked about the sex difference is because evolutionarily, it makes sense that for
Yeah,
men, sex would be both rewarding and reinforcing,
yeah,
right? Because
right,
every time that you
right,
do it, and especially if it's with
right,
a new partner,
right,
it's
right,
going to increase the probability of passing genes down
right.
to the next generation, which is almost
Yes.
always a good idea if you're in a male
Yeah.
body. It's not
Yeah.
always a good idea if you have a female body because you're the one who
No, the
bears the cost
opposite.
of pregnancy. Yeah, and it could
Evolution
be
should have pressured women to have a low sex drive so they can be careful consumers of sex.
right,
If they have a
exactly.
really
So,
high sex drive, they're going to get pregnant with the wrong guy. They got to be
right.
choosy. They got to find the, you know, all this. They got to, find the guys with the good genes who are going to stick around, help breathe here, all those sorts of things. And if they are just wildly having sex at the first guy that came around, they're not going to be a good chooser. And women are so limited in their reproductive biology. Men, it doesn't matter if you have a few kids with bad genetic loadings. If you
Bad
have enough
genes.
of them, the odds average out. But women, we're born with the number of eggs. We have this short reproductive cycle from puberty to menopause, and 9 months of rearing pregnancy, and then many years of rearing. So we're very limited in the number of genes that we can, or offspring that we can pass our genes along to. So women have to choose carefully who they mate with. And by having a lower sex drive, that it doesn't just, take over your brain and have sex as soon as you feel that urge, that spontaneous out of nowhere feeling, but rather it's just like, no, I gotta assess the situation here. Is this good for me? Is this going to make me, is this the right guy? But in current day common, if you're not, reproductively viable as a menopausal woman, you're still assessing, is this situation right for me? That's kind of, I think, what we've evolved to be. We're tuned in. Do I want to have sex with you? Were you nice to me? Are you gonna clean up after yourself tomorrow if I have sex? There's all these conditions.
Yeah, it's like just another way that I feel like women have been led to feel sort of sexually broken because our understanding of human sexuality was so much based on what's normal in men. And so
Yeah,
I really do think that, that for women, it doesn't make sense to have sex be super reinforcing, where it's like you have
yeah,
it and then you're like, oh my gosh, I need to do that again. Like I need to do
yeah,
that again now.
yeah,
Whereas I think that it
yeah,
does sort of stoke the flames of a dopaminergic drive in men, where it's just like rewarding and
yeah,
reinforcing all at once. And that for women,
yeah,
it's less that way, and that it's built
yeah,
that way on purpose. And
yeah,
that we need to not define ourselves as disordered. I think there's a lot of women out there who think that, they have just like, sexual dysfunction just because they don't have this rapacious, like desire for sexual contact all the time, and that and that they do
right.
respond differently than men.
And the other thing, I mean, the way sex is presented, in movies, in the media, whatever, it is like, it gives this false impression that people are having sex all the time and it's wildly passionate all the time. And, people lie too. They don't want to say, yeah, my husband and I, we only have sex every couple months. They're like, no one wants to say that because then they'd be judged. And so I think people are lying to each other and pretending they're having more sex than they are. And so that's also plays into it of, oh, wow, well, I bet they're having sex all the time. What's wrong with us kind of thing,
Right. So I want to ask you really quickly. Speaking of people having sex and why people have sex, I want to talk to you about your book that you wrote with my mentor, David Buss, about why women have sex. And what I thought was so cool about this book and all of the research that has led up to it. You guys cataloged, I think it was 237 unique reasons that women have sex. And so, what are some of the what are some of the things that lead women to want to have sex? What are the reasons that women are having sex? And what do you learn from that? The fact that there's all of these different reasons that women have sex, what does that tell us about female sexuality?
Right. Well, there's all of the reasons that you would predict. And also, I think that people assume people have sex. Why do they have sex? And by the way, our book was based on an academic paper we wrote, which included men. It was called Why Humans Have Sex. And then we decided, people were probably more interested in women, so we wrote the book on that. But why do you have sex? Because it feels good, because you want to reproduce, because you're in love, and what else could there be? And so nobody had really researched, looked into it in any great depth until we did our study. And then documenting these vast reasons. I mean, some of them, a lot of them had to do with competition and revenge and, certainly love, but not just because you love the person, because you're trying to steal love or get over love or, find love. And as one woman in our study put, the best way to get over a man is to get under another one. And so, and then competition between people. And then the medicinal reasons, where people were having an orgasm because it got rid of a migraine, or it helped them sleep, or it alleviated stress, and then because they were bored, there was nothing else on TV, so might as well have sex. And then all the dark side of them, of course. Why women have sex. It's not why women want sex, it's why they're having sex. And women have sex because they're pressured, they're coerced, they're forced, they're threatened, all of those reasons. Duty sex was a big reason. I
love duty sex. I just have to interrupt you to say that I love when I first saw the term duty sex in your work. And it was like when I first learned the word schadenfreude, right? Which means it's just that feeling that you get when you feel pleasure in response to somebody else's failure. And like the first time I saw that word, I'm like, I know exactly what that is. Once I knew the definition, I felt
coined it before, but everybody knows what we're talking about.
And duty sex, I felt very seen.
Yeah,
I think anybody who's been in a relationship.
Most women do. And so, for some women, I mean, duty sex, let's just, what I'm talking about is sex out of a feeling of obligation, right? That obligation might be because you were taught as a woman it's your duty to please your husband, or for some women they engage in duty sex because they feel if they don't, their partner will stray. So it's kind of a mate guarding tactic. Doesn't really work, but anyways, or as also to make sure that their partner is fulfilled and won't leave them. So there's those reasons. For some,
I think there's. Do you also consider it? Because when I hear duty sex, I was thinking of like, I don't really feel like doing this, but I love my partner and I want them to be happy, and
absolutely.
so. Yeah,
absolutely. And so the point I was going to make here is when we hear duty sex, we always think, poor you, sorry, you're having duty sex, but it's not always bad. It's the affect afterwards. How do you feel after you've had sex to please your partner and duty sex? And if it leads you to feel used and not very good about yourself, then it's probably something you don't want to engage in. You want to find out a different solution. But for many women, it was like, oh no, it's fine. They take out the garbage. I have sex with them. It's a great exchange. We all do things we don't want to do, and who can? Or like you said, I love my partner, and it makes me feel good to pleasure them. So it's not necessarily a negative thing or something that's bad in a relationship. It's only bad if it leads to resentment and regret, and ultimately a lower self-esteem. Then it's not a good thing.
Yeah, I feel like, the fact that you were able to, aside from some of the more negative things like, women being coerced into sex, the fact that there's so many different reasons that people have sex, I think goes to show us that it serves so many different functions. It's not just about reproduction. I think that sometimes
Absolutely.
There's that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It can serve a connection function. It can serve, a medicinal function. It can serve a mate poaching function. It can serve all kinds of different functions. And it just goes to show how complex our psychology is.
Absolutely.
And so I'm going to close. I just want to ask you, because you've been so wonderful giving me so much of your time. And I want to know what's on the horizon, like with female sexual desire. So I know that you've served as an FDA consultant on a number of different treatments for sexual desire disorder and different types of sexual dysfunction in women. I'm really curious about if there's anything happening in that space that you feel really excited about, or if it's within your own work. You talked about this really lovely intervention that you're going to be doing with menopausal women. What are some of the things that you're excited about in terms of helping to especially help women who are struggling with their sex lives?
Yeah, well, I guess, I don't know, maybe it's a function of my age, but I am spending more time looking at the menopausal literature. As I mentioned, one of my graduate students, who it was kind of funny because when I suggested it to her, she said, menopause, I'm only 25. And I said, I know, just think how prepared you'll be when you hit menopause. and then she came back the next day. She said, I told my mom that you suggested I should do menopause research, and she said she'd even fund it. so she's like taken that, and we actually we're at a conference in Portugal this summer and another one in California where we presented some of her early research on the sexual schemas among menopausal women. So I'm kind of jazzed up about that. One of my other graduate students is looking at the role of shame and religious messaging in sexuality and how that plays out. And then I'm involved, I guess I could say this, in a company by the name of Stripes. It's a company that was founded by Naomi Watts, and I've joined them as their scientific advisor. And so right now they have primarily skin products for women, but they're going into the sexual health field. And there's some exciting things on the horizon there that I'm working with them on. So that's been really fun. So yeah, menopausal sexuality seems to be where I've found myself at the moment.
Well, I think that even if you are so if you're a listener, for example, and you're not anywhere near the menopausal transition, I think we're going to find out that a lot of the same processes that help to facilitate the sexual response in menopausal women is ultimately also going to then be able to help sexual functioning in women who've experienced sexual trauma, and just women who have hypoactive sexual desire disorder and they're premenopausal. I think that the research that you're doing will probably end up having really broad applications. Just like you did this writing intervention with the women who
Yeah.
had experienced sexual trauma, and now you're looking and seeing whether there's these same therapeutic effects in menopausal women. I think that the reverse is also going to be true, right? Where if you find something that seems to be working really well in menopausal women, I mean, obviously other than hormone therapy, which, we wouldn't want to necessarily give that to our premenopausal women.
Right.
But it will ultimately end up informing care in both directions.
Yeah, absolutely. It has widespread applications and implications, I think. But also, I think you need to write another book, because your wonderful book was focusing on hormones and birth control. But you talk about hormonal changes with menopause. I mean, a woman is used to, this level of hormones, and then suddenly the dramatic decline in estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, and then another drop in testosterone later on. I mean, the impact that has, not just on your sexual function, but on your mood, your emotion, all of those things. And so when we talk about the loss of sex drive with menopause, and that, it's generally attributed to hormonal loss, yes, but not just from a physiological perspective. Is it also that changing the way we're interpreting the sexual situation? As I've talked a lot about with you this hour, is the importance of context. But do hormones impact the way that women are viewing that context, and are less things sexually appealing just because of emotions and attentional resources and all of those things? And then when you go on hormone replacement therapy, what levels are you trying to get to? You don't want to go back to where you were in your 20s, but sometimes a little tiny bit can be way too much. I've been a guinea pig on myself with hormones, because I just find them so fascinating, and my experience, I could certainly write a whole book on that. It's just wild.
Yeah, we should collaborate on that project. What do you think about hormone therapy for women going through the menopausal transition? There's now that the black box warning or the black label warning has been taken off of hormones, more women are interested in them. What's your take? Good, bad, indifferent?
Oh, well, for me personally, I would not be off hormones. I mean, I had a little bit of a different experience. I never actually went through menopause, which is kind of strange, I know, but I elected to have my ovaries out in my 40s. They're just causing no good. And my sister had died of ovarian cancer at a very early age, and I'm just like, get those puppies out of me. And so I was immediately put on hormone replacement therapy, and I've never gone off, and I will never go off. But I've, tried changing the formulas over the time, and I think I've got it figured out what feels good for me. So, but, every woman is different. You have to feel comfortable with it. A lot of women are, well, not the women, it's the doctors that are still so ill-informed, because the World Health Initiative study did such a disservice for women for 2 decades now. With this unjustified scare of cancer risk. And now we know that, it's really safe. It's also preventative for a number of aging disorders. And, unless you have a family history that puts you at high risk, or you have the genetic loading for certain cancers, and it's not a good idea. But, barring that, I think, not just for sexuality, but for keeping tissue more youthful, for cognitive function, lack of that, loss of, word finding ability, the loss of the fogginess, a feeling, so much of that is linked up to estrogen loss. And you're already going through these body changes, and then you can't think of things and your head's foggy. I mean, that doesn't make you feel good. That doesn't,
No.
so I'm staying on it for life, and there's nothing that's gonna take it. But that's just me. And some people are like, no way I'm going on it. So you just have to figure out what's good for you.
I think for me, and I was 44 when I first started noticing that my brain was foggy and I was like forgetting words. And even though my hormone tests were coming back normal and my cycles were normal, I knew what was happening. And thankfully I had a doctor who was thoughtful enough to actually listen to what I had to say. And I'd been tracking my cycles and everything for a really long time. And also my hormones, I would get them measured every year. And so even though I was still normal, my cycles were normal, my hormones were low for me. And so I started on that. And one of my friends who's an older woman said, and I feel exactly the same way. And she said, she's like, I love my estrogen patch. And when I die, I'm going to have them tape it to my coffin.
I pretty much feel the same way.
And so I think that there are so many wonderful benefits that women can get from hormone therapy, but also like for those of you who are listening, if you are ever thinking that you want to consider hormones or you don't want to consider hormones, I do think like one of the things that makes me uncomfortable with the new language around menopause and hormone therapy, which I think is so wonderful, and I'm so glad that the bars are starting to sort of lift and increase access, but I do think that it's now led to this sort of perception that there's something wrong with going through menopause and that it's a pathology, instead of the fact that this is, like instead of, which, if you don't want to go on hormones, you don't have to, because it is a very natural transition that women have been going through since time immemorial. And so you don't have to feel pressure to go on hormones. They're very therapeutic to a lot of women. Cindy loves them. I love them. But you don't have to be on them.
You don't have to be on them, but I will say that, we didn't live as long as we're living now. I mean, evolutionarily speaking, we died off shortly after menopause, right? People died off in their 60s. And so now, do you want to spend like more than a third of your life, maybe a half of your life, hormonally deprived? I don't.
Right. And we do live longer. There is evidence that menopause is selected for, right? And that it's not just a byproduct of the fact that we live longer, and that it does seem to be happening intentionally to shift women's effort away from direct reproduction and more toward, investment in collateral kin. So whether it's grandchildren or nieces and nephews, and just this idea that it's shifting us from a primary reproductive goal into a caregiving role. And, but nonetheless, we didn't live as long as we did. And maybe we lived, for 10 years postmenopausal, and now we're living, 20, 30, 40 years postmenopause. In my mom's case, she went through early menopause, 50 years probably. And do you want to go through this time without any hormones at all, or would you feel better? I think that it's good that we're starting to have more conversations around hormone therapy and stopping with the scare tactics that have been preventing so many women to getting access for so long.
Exactly. I agree.
Well, thank you so much. There was so much that we learned from you during our time together, and I could have probably talked to you for 3 more hours, but I'm going to try to be conscious of your time. Thank you so much, Dr. Cindy Meston.
Really fun. Thank you.
Dr. Cindy Meston, thank you so much for joining us on the XX Lab. And that's it for today's episode of the XX Lab. If you want more, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show, a rating or review helps other people find it. See you next episode.